Thank you, Marisa, and thank you to all of the comrades who have come together tonight and everyone who is working so hard today and all the days earlier this week and who have been working for the past months to help start the working class fight back, which is so urgently needed. The May 30th car caravans are extremely important for the broader movement. It's the second time in 2 months that the PSL, along with other organizations and progressive individuals, have come together to carry out car caravan protests demanding the cancellation of rents and mortgages during the course of this pandemic, especially for those who have lost their jobs and income and who can't pay rent and can't pay their mortgage. On April 25th, we had more than 45 cities, and we expect that this coming May 30th will be another extremely strong showing all around the country, big towns, small towns, everywhere, raising the demand, cancel the rents. Since we initiated those caravans a month ago, the slogan, cancel the rents, has really caught on. It's going everywhere, in fact. Even Joe Biden, representing the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party establishment, which would be 99.9% of that establishment, even Joe Biden has said that there should be rent forgiveness. That's a consequence of the growing pressure of the people on the government and on both ruling class parties. What we are witnessing right now is the complete absurdity of the capitalist system. We see it all. It reveals its horrors, its cruelties, its absurdities, its banalities in front of everyone. At this very moment, and just days ago, Jerome Powell, who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank, the bankers' bank, announced that there would be federal bank intervention without limit for the biggest banks and corporations and hedge funds. He said the federal bank will intervene without limits. He said there is no limit. The Federal Reserve has already offered more than $4 trillion in no-strings loans to the biggest banks and corporations. In fact, the federal government and the Federal Reserve have basically stood in and now have revived or sustained, is a better way to put it, the entire capitalist class. If it wasn't for the intervention of the state, the capitalist state, on behalf of the corporations and banks, the capitalist class itself would be understood to be a zombie class, still functioning, still apparently in business, but completely and utterly bankrupt. The capitalist class is in fact bankrupt, but its bankruptcy is being camouflaged by the intervention of the central bank, giving the same capitalist class, a superfluous class, a non-essential class, everything it needs to sustain the mythology that it exists. And of course, it's doing this in order to overcome the problems and the crisis facing the capitalist class as a class at this moment, with the hope that eventually there will be an economic revival and the capitalists can go on being able to reap all of the profits and benefits from society, to reap through the form of capital, which is created by the labor of wage workers, all that they need in order to sustain and build their already obscene fortunes. But for the time being, the capitalist class has been basically extinguished, or would have been extinguished, if it wasn't for the intervention of the central state. Jerome Powell said that on Monday. We will intervene without limit, he said. At the same time, 40 million workers in the United States, it's almost 40 million, have filed for unemployment insurance. Many have still not received any unemployment insurance, even those who are eligible. And then there are another 10 million who are not eligible, either because of their immigration status or because they work in occupations that are not covered by unemployment insurance. But they too are jobless. The number of people who have become jobless in the United States is really about 50 million people. 50 million. They have lost their jobs and their incomes, and they can't pay rent and they can't pay their mortgages. And the reason the economy had to be shut down was because of the criminal negligence and malfeasance of the Trump administration and Congress in their failure to prepare the population and society for what they knew was coming. The senators, both Democrats and Republicans, when they were briefed in January by the intelligence agencies that the COVID-19 was coming to the United States, they engaged in insider trading. They sold their stocks in the areas where they knew the economy would be devastated. They hid, though, from the American people what was coming. And the Trump administration, of course, and Donald Trump himself, only minimized, only told the American people, don't worry, relax. This is going to be great. It's going to get better. People will be cured by themselves. If you're not cured, you can always use disinfectant bleach. Maybe you'd like to inject yourself with it. I mean, the chaos and idiocy of the capitalist government was on full display. And now tens of millions of people are unemployed, and the federal government says, without limit, we will sustain the biggest banks and corporations and hedge funds. And our argument is very simple, sisters and brothers, very simple. If the federal government has the resources, money without limit, to finance and bankroll corporations and banks and hedge funds, then they have those resources available to give workers 100% of their salaries and wages. And absent that, they have the authority, the executive authority, and the financial resources to cancel the rents for the duration of this pandemic. People ask us, is this an achievable demand? Yes. The only issue is about priorities, and it's about power. If the U.S. government is scared enough of the working class, all of this is easily achievable. If the U.S. working class and the U.S. population continues to be simply afraid of the government, then we won't realize it. Our task is to give people confidence that we can fight, we can mobilize, that we have strength in numbers, and that we can win. 40% of the population on June 1st will not be able to pay rent. They will not be able to pay rent. They will not be able to pay for many of them their mortgages. We have to demand from the federal government that it do that which is certainly possible and achievable. In 2008, there was another capitalist economic crisis, and the government at that time took a pen and drew a circle around the 5 biggest banks. JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs. It drew a circle around them and said, they're not going to fail. They're too big to fail. Right now, the capitalist government is saying basically that the private sector, as they put it, which is just a euphemism for the capitalist class, is too big to fail. And so they're subsidizing completely the capitalist class so it does not go completely down. They are doing this. The New York Times on Wednesday has the headline, too big to fail, the entire private sector, meaning too big to fail, the entire private sector. In this article, you can see it for yourself, shows that what the Federal Reserve government is doing is standing in for the oil companies, for the mining companies, for the airlines, especially for the banks, and paying all of the bills. The government has essentially taken control over all of the portfolios of all of these industries and banks, the biggest capitalists. They're doing, again, what they did in 2008, but it's on a far larger scale. There was $660 billion allocated in the Troubled Asset Relief Program, Tarp, whereby the federal government and the Federal Reserve Bank bought the bad debt of the banks and kept those biggest banks alive. Now they're doing it with the entire capitalist class. I mean, just think about this for a second. We're told all the time by the media, certainly when we were children in school, that there's a difference between capitalism and socialism. It goes something like this. Capitalism rewards enterprise. It rewards risk-taking. People have a good idea. They risk their own money. They go out and they make a commodity. If the commodity sells, if the customers like it, if it's efficient enough, if it's attractive enough, if it's cheap enough, it will survive. And the risk takers who have a good idea and through their hard work succeed, they're rewarded and they get rich. Others fail, they go bankrupt. If they're lucky, they get bought out. It's the private free market. Socialism, we're told, is a state-run economy. All of the decisions are made by the state institutions, by state bureaucracy. It's centralized planning. The entrepreneurial drive of individuals is taken away. Those who want to risk are not allowed to or not incentivized to take a risk because there's no reward. They can't get rich. You know the basic scenario. Capitalism is a private market, freedom, individually run. Socialism is a state bureaucracy, central planning, a command economy. What this crisis shows is that capitalism is 100% a state-run system. Monopoly capitalism has fused with the state. Monopoly finance capital, the biggest banks, have fused with the state. The capitalist class cannot exist without the state. The state is always there to rescue it. There is no risk for the biggest capitalists because they are given bailouts endlessly. This is the second time within 12 years that it's happening. The second time really within 10 years. The difference between socialism and capitalism is not whether or not the state intervenes. The state intervenes in both economic models. But in a capitalist economy, the state intervenes for the corporations, the banks, the hedge funds, the 1%, the 0.1%, the already very, very, very rich, those who are too big to fail and too big to jail. In 2008 and 2009, when the corporations and especially the banks torpedoed the economy, creating chaos, 9 million families sent into foreclosure, 20 million people lost their jobs. During that entire time, the jobless were not bailed out. The people sent into foreclosure for no reason of their own, but because they lived in a collapsing capitalist economy, they were not bailed out. It was the bankers who were bailed out. Capitalism is the state-run economy on behalf of a very, very, very small, tiny minority. It's an absurd system. In April, 1.4 million healthcare workers were laid off. Yes, you heard me right. 1.4 million healthcare professionals were laid off in the middle of COVID-19 because their hospitals were not making enough money through other medical procedures because healthcare is nothing but a commodity. 256 hospitals had to lay off workers in the month of April alone. That's continuing. The absurdity of a system where in Elmhurst, Queens, patients were being brought in on ambulances and there were no beds for them. No beds whatsoever. The ICU in Elmhurst was filled up and older people in particular were being triaged. If you're 70 or 75 and you have a severe COVID symptoms, you weren't getting the ventilator. They put you perhaps in a corridor. The hospital workers didn't want to do that, but there was no room. They had to make decisions, triage. Some were able to be treated and some were left to die. A few blocks, maybe a half a mile from Elmhurst Hospital, there were hospitals, private hospitals, for-profit hospitals that had plenty of beds. They were wide open, but they weren't taking patients. The ambulances had to direct to Elmhurst. Finally, Governor Cuomo called a meeting insisting that the hospitals begin some level minimal level of cooperation. That's an absurd system. It's an absurd system when you have perhaps 700,000 people who we know are homeless today. And there are millions of vacant homes. There are so many university dormitories that are left vacant right now. So many places where the homeless could live. But the homeless who are told, to, like the rest of society, to socially distance can't because they don't have a home. In New York City, 114,000 kids in the public schools in New York, which was the epicenter of the epicenter, 114,000 kids, that's 1 out of every 10, is homeless. In New York City, where the Wall Street bankers and hedge funds and corporate elites are being bailed out with trillions of dollars. That's an absurd system. It's a system that needs to go. When we talk about socialism, we mean a society that also has government intervention, but on behalf of the majority, on behalf of those who work. In a socialist society, we wouldn't have to demand cancellation of rents because there will be no rent. There will be no interest payments to banks for mortgages on housing. A socialist society says to the population, housing is your right. Your home belongs to you. No one can take it from you. It's an absolute right. The capitalists say they're all about individual rights and freedoms. But the individuals in America, in capitalist America, they don't have a right to a home. They can vote for whoever's going to oppress them for the next 2 or 4 years, but they don't have a right to a home. They don't have a right to a job. They don't have a right to health care. A socialist society means that these things are not commodities. They're not to be bought and sold. They're not a source of profit. It's time to end the whole system where we have lords of the landlords, this cruel, ridiculous, and criminal sort of leftover from the feudal era. Socialism means the working class has the right to survive, and its rights and needs are guaranteed. That's not complex, and it's completely achievable. We're going to go out and build these caravans for May 30th, but we have to do a lot more than that. We have to organize with everyone we can find who's willing to struggle, who's willing to fight. Everyone who recognizes that the fundamental injustice here is a society that allows private capital to reign supreme. In the last 2 months, Jeff Bezos made $24 billion more because people are reliant on Amazon services and at-home delivery. He did no work. It was Amazon warehouse workers who are sped up, who are being taken out in ambulances because the speed up and workload is so heavy. It's the delivery drivers. It's those who are packing the boxes. $24 billion more for Jeff Bezos in the last 2 months. That's an absurd system. Amazon should be nationalized, meaning under the control of the people. It should be turned into a public utility. Jeff Bezos is worth $130 billion. If you took 99.9% of his money, he'd still have about $1 million. The bourgeoisie is living off the work and the labor of the working class. These are ill-gotten wealth. Amazon should be seized and turned into a public utility, and the same should happen to the banks and to the biggest corporations. But in the meantime, June 1st is coming. Rents have to be paid. Mortgages have to be paid. Even if there's a patchwork of moratorium laws, they're not enough because you're going to accrue debt so that by July or August, you won't be able to pay it. We're fighting for socialism, but right now we have to fight so that working class people who did not create this crisis are not evicted from their homes. Is that an achievable demand? Yes, it is. The only issue really for us is how hard and how big this fight will be. That's what we're dedicated to doing. We have to organize, 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 mobilize the working class, help the working class recognize that the working class need not simply be a victim of a system. It should be able to take hold of society's reins, reorganize society, make it rational, make it humane, make it for the people.